For more on the situation in Ukraine, we have Ambassador William Taylor with us and Jim Jatras. William is Vice President for the Middle East and Africa at the United States Institute of Peace and served as the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. Jim, of course, Deputy Director at the American Institute in Ukraine and a Government Relations and Public Advocacy Specialist. I want to thank both of you for coming on the broadcast. Why don't we start with that meeting and the comments from the U.S. President himself. Let's take a listen to what he said, and then I want to get reaction from both of you. This is the U.S. President of the United States.
We had a chance to discuss the situation in Ukraine and the increasingly aggressive posture that Russia has taken. And we affirmed that NATO is the cornerstone, not just of transatlantic security, but in many ways is the cornerstone for global security.
Jim, why don't I start with you? Is he spot on?
No, I don't think he is. I forget who said it, but somebody once said that the main job NATO has is to take care of the problems caused by NATO's existence. I think it's an organization that should have gone out of business at the end of the Cold War, and I don't think it can be the cornerstone of European security and simply aggravating the situation in Ukraine.
Ambassador Taylor.
Of course, the president is right on this one. NATO does have a role now. It has been looking for a role for some time, but now that the Russians are increasingly aggressive and have invaded their neighbor, violating the sovereignty of Ukraine, NATO has a role again.
What about slowing down the ceasefire violations? We have seen a tamping down in the violence, so I think both of you can agree to that, but there still are these violations. What needs to be done there? Why don't I start with you, Jim?
Well, I think the second Minsk agreement is the only game in town at this moment, something that the Europeans, not the Americans, came up with. And at this point, I think there's really no alternative, if we want a peaceful solution, to move forward with a political agreement, which Kiev steadfastly refuses to do. They still talk about whether they're going to reconquer Crimea, they're going to reconquer the Donetsk airport. You know, war is not going to solve this problem. They need to talk to the people in Lugansk and Donetsk and not just call them terrorists.
You looked quizzical at that.
I would agree with Jim that the Minsk II agreement is the road to take. I would also think, I disagree actually with Jim, that the Ukrainians are not willing to do that. The Ukrainians are ready to abide by that. It is the Russians who have been violating the terms of the Minsk agreement. What needs to happen is the Russians and their proxies in eastern Ukraine need to allow the OSCE monitors to come into all across the occupied parts of Ukraine. Then they can tell who's actually violating, and they can monitor the border.
What do you think about that solution?
I think it's a secondary consideration. Again, the ceasefire violations, and of course each side accuses the other of the violations. You're talking about a ceasefire there. The essence is a political settlement. There has to be some agreement on what the status of these regions are in the east, and that Kiev does not want to do.
You have to agree to a certain extent. Kiev's not really all that crazy about this.
Kiev is ready to do it, and what it has said, what the Minsk agreement talks about and calls for, are elections under Ukrainian law. And the Ukrainians in Kiev and across the country have been ready to move to elections under Ukrainian law, but that's not what the separatists and the Russians who are there with the separatists are calling for. They're calling for elections under their own law. That's just not going to work.
And all these issues to me always seem as though they're very stark. One side it says it's black and white, the other says it's black and white, and of course they see it entirely differently. What do you think why don't I start with you, Ambassador? What do you think Russia can do, and also the government in Kiev, to really get this thing moving forward?
What they can do is call on their supporters. What the Russians can do is call on their supporters and their own troops who are in eastern Ukraine, southeastern Ukraine, to abide by the terms that they've agreed to. And what this means is have the election under Ukrainian law and under the observation of the OSCE. That's the political solution that Jim and I agree on.
And the government in Kiev, what can they do?
Government in Kiev can do what they are obligated to do under the Minsk agreement, which is to decentralize decision-making across the country, but including in Donbass. Right now, it is a centralized form of government. Most of the serious decisions are made in Kyiv. That needs to change, and they can pass legislation to make that change and devolve responsibility to the regions.
I see you nodding your head.
I agree entirely, and the ambassador is right. This should take place across Ukraine, but specifically with regard to Lugansk and Donetsk, how are you going to hold these elections under any law unless the two sides talk, unless you stop calling these people terrorists, sit down at the same table and work out the modalities for doing that? Kiev won't do that. They only call them terrorists, anti-terrorist operations. We need weapons. We need to train our forces. We're going to recapture these areas. That's, that's not conducive to that kind of agreement.
The government in Kyiv does want to have people on the other side of the table to have this discussion with. And they want those people on the other side of the table who come from Luhansk and Donetsk, from the Donbass, to be elected, reasonably, legitimately elected. The people who are there now were not elected. They appointed themselves.
That's a circular argument. We can't have elections until we talk to people about how to have the elections, but we can't talk to anybody until they're elected. I don't see how that's going to work.
Let me ask you
talk with what is.
Let me ask you about the United States and their role. Former NATO General Wesley Clark came out some time ago and said that the Russians were going to launch an offensive on May 9th. That has not happened. And he said that lethal weapons needed to get into Ukraine. Does the rhetoric here in the United States need to be tamped down some as well? It seems like there's a lot of saber rattling going on. We're seeing these NATO exercises, the Russians also having exercises. What needs to be done in that regard?
There's not a military solution to this, as we've always said, as everyone says. This is not going to be fought out in the southeastern part of Ukraine. This is going to be negotiated. It's going to be discussed. This is going to be a political solution that allows the legitimately elected government in Kyiv and legitimately elected government in Donbass to come to a solution without the interference of the Russians. That's the way forward. It's if there are weapons, that is not necessarily the way forward.
Jim, briefly, if you can.
Is that a change in your position, Mr. Ambassador? Because I believe you previously called for providing lethal weapons to Kiev, and if you've stepped back from that, I welcome that, because I think there has to be a political solution. All this talk about offensives that are not going to take place as a red herring in order to justify a planned attack from Kiev, I just don't think are right.
Yeah, weapons would be fine. Political solution is the way to move.
All right. Both of you, thanks so much for coming in. Lively conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.